The studios that brought you Shame of the Cities, or Tammany Hall Goes Tweed, and Graft Can Be Beautiful, now present Rolling Right Along. Ladies and gentlemen, your ghostly host for this visit to the past, the Honorable George Barnsdale Cox, Boss.
There are those, I suppose, among you who may judge it odd that I, long a respected foe, I might even say a beloved foe of all political reformers, that I, these 58 years dead and gone, should be willing to look back across the pale to interpret 50 years of your own history to you on this momentous occasion. Well, my friends, my reasons will become apparent as we go rolling right along. Right up through the end of World War I, the times were right for political bosses in most American cities. In spite of what that turn-of-the-century troublemaker Lincoln Steffens said, he called Cincinnati the worst governed city in America. But I couldn't see why. Just because my boy Mike Mullen could pitch an annual $15,000 picnic for all his friends up at Coney Island when his salary was only $1,100 a year, or because one year my man in the county courthouse, Treasurer Rudd Heinecke, pilfered a measly little $215,000 in county funds. In spite of silk-stocking reformers like Edward J. Dempsey and Henry T. Hunt, who got themselves elected mayor of Cincinnati once in a while just to irritate me, I held the courthouse and city hall in the palm of my hand for 30 years, beginning right after the riots of 1884, when some aroused citizens burned the courthouse and sent two of my predecessor bosses hightailing it out of town. Oh, it was a dandy 30 years. But when I passed over in 1916, old Rudd Heinecke just couldn't keep things together. Now, I knew people and knew when to be tough and when to humor them, and just how much humoring it took to keep them in line. Good old Rudd, he did dumb things like sending that telegram. He was living in New York by then, running his burlesque theaters and trying to run Cincinnati by long distance. Well now, the Post got hold of that telegram and printed it. Rudd was ordering his 31 Republican machine votes in City Council to approve a gas rate increase that our friends at the gas company wanted and, who knows, may even have needed. Now that was dumb. By 17 and 18, the times were very wrong for the grand old party and the grand old ways. People were shouting about corruption and demanding services from city government. Somebody said the potholes in the streets in Cincinnati showed just how bad the city government was. A lot of young Cincinnatians were learning that the city's business was their business because their taxes paid the city's costs. Oh, you could smell change in the air and read it in the faces of the people who turned out to look at the Liberty Bell when it toured through Cincinnati in 1917. Then a young World War I officer named Victor Heinz formed the Cincinnatus Association in 1920, and soon the group that was to spell the downfall for Heinecke and machine politics in Cincinnati had gathered around him. Charles P. Taft II, Russell Wilson, Murray Seasongood, Henry Bentley. As early as 1921, Seasongood was suggesting the need for amendments to the city charter. And by 1923, Bentley and a group of his friends formed the Birdless Ballot League. Now, they were upset just because Cincinnati was the only city in Ohio that still listed city council candidates by political party. An eagle for the Republicans and a chicken for the Democrats. I myself thought it gave the city a certain distinction. It certainly dressed up the ballot, but Bentley said he wanted to vote for men, not birds. About that same time, Wilson and Taft were snapping at the city's heels about street maintenance, and that's when Seasongood went one night to report to the Cincinnati Association. He had a dangerous proposition. He said the only way to get Heineke and our friends out of office was to starve them out. Of course the GOP had put another tax levy on the ballot. When hadn't they? That shot heard round the wards kept being repeated by Murray and his friends to anybody who would listen, and the levy failed. In 1924, that birdless ballot bunch got together with some other reform-minded malcontents. A group that wanted the city manager got linked up with a group that wanted the nonpartisan ballot and another group that was against corruption. They formed a single group, single-mindedly devoted to passing a simple, easily comprehended amendment to the city charter, one that would provide for a 9-man council, all members elected at large, a mayor elected from within the council's ranks, an appointed non-political city manager to administer the city's business, a nonpartisan ballot, proportional representation voting to assure minority voices in council, and a civil service system to assure fairness in appointments for all city jobs. There were 6 petitioners to get that charter amendment onto the 1924 ballot: Agnes Hilton, Guy Mallon, Marietta B. Tawney, Ed F. Alexander, Murray Seasongood, and Henry Bentley. Oh, our guys weren't worried. Hell, we didn't even think about those snooty, elitist reformers. We had our strengths. Over 6,800 city jobs, all filled with warm and devoted friends of the GOP. And besides, it took over 20,000 signatures on the petitions just to get the amendment on the ballot. We were sure they'd never get that many. But they did. Well, once that amendment was on the ballot, the GOP gang, that is, group, had to try to beat the reformers at their own game. So, the party put up 2 very similar amendments of its own. They slated the Charter Committee's proposal after the GOP's 2 proposals and figured that in all of the confusion, all 3 would be defeated. Wrong. The Charter Committee mounted a no, no, yes campaign that worked. The Charter Committee's amendment passed 92,000 votes to 41,000. And November of 1924 was the end of the line for bossism in Cincinnati. In early 1925, Dr. John Withrow proposed that the Charter Committee should organize as a party and run its own candidates, rather than simply endorsing the candidates of other parties. The proposal carried. The independent Democrats and Republicans who made up the Charter Committee felt that municipal government should be divorced from national politics, there being, as they said, no Republican or Democratic way to build a road or a park, only a right way and a wrong way. That decision was momentous. And so were the results of the 1925 election, the first held under the newly amended charter. Edward T. Dixon, Tyler Field, Julius Luxinger, Stanley Matthews, Charles O. Rose, and Murray Seasongood, all Charterites, were elected, a 6-3 majority over the old GOP regime. Cecil Gamble, another Charterite, lost by only 100 votes, or the majority would have been 7-2, a feat not accomplished until 1973 under the new Charter Democratic Coalition. Charter met less success when it tried to spread good government into the county wasteland. Bob Hoyk and Samuel Ock joined C.P. Taft and Victor Heinz in that effort. But during that period, Charter became a party, a force, all because the committee took advantage of something I'd known all along and kept to myself, that an informed electorate is a dangerous electorate. Keeping that electorate informed was a volunteer effort during those early days, and it stayed so until the Charter Committee brought in former editorial writer Forrest Frank as executive director in 1934, a post he filled until 1972, and one now filled by Bill Hamilton. In 1947, the party hired Louise Hobart as Forrest's assistant and as director of women's activities. In the campaigns of the late 40s and early 50s, Esther Kuhn was instrumental in organizing the gigantic field effort on which so much Charter's success has traditionally rested. One election, 1931 for example, Charter had 2,300 people out working the polls, mainly women. Charter has always felt that women should be represented on its board and in city council. The party nominated Mary L. Hicks for council in 1925. Elizabeth Cassatt Reed long led the work of the women's division, was elected to council in 1943, and later, as Mrs. Albert D. Cash, served as board president. Of Charter's many distinguished and capable finance chairmen, Ralph Holterhoff, its first, was perhaps the most notable, in that he single-handedly raised the money for the committee's beginnings and for the first 15 years of its life, even after relinquishing the finance chairman title. As its first city manager, the charter-dominated 1926 council chose Colonel C.O. Sherrill, and in 50 years of charter, the city manager's chair has also been filled with distinction by Clarence Dykstra, C.A. Harrell, and E. Robert Turner. In those early days, both levels of Charter's leadership, the board and the elected councilmen, were the same sort of people, hilltoppers, white, East Siders, middle class, better educated, elitist even. And during the first decade of Charter's control of the city, that picture stayed pretty much the same. Being human, the Charterites differed widely on issues, and there was one major battle. The councilmen were on one side, the board on the other. The question, would the non-elected board dictate legislation and voting to the elected councilmen? Would the Charter Committee turn into a new style bossism? The debate raged on, even after John Emory replaced Henry Bentley as president in 1935, and during Harry Drackett's term as president. In 1938, Albert D. Cash, who would be mayor from 47 to 51, and Drackett introduced the Action Committee meetings. These quickly transformed themselves into the regular Wednesday meetings of board and councilmen, and only then did the issue of councilmen's independence resolve itself. By 32, the national burgeoning of democratic awareness and strength with the big Roosevelt win caused some fallout in the charter ranks. And in 36, the GOP made a strong comeback. But it wasn't my boys. Unlike the good old days when I ran the city from my saloon, now the Republicans were slating really respectable people, like Willis Gradison and James G. Stewart. That 1936 council was made up of 4 charter coalition candidates: Anthony B. Dunlap, Edward B. Embus, James Wilson, and Russell Wilson. 4 Republicans and an independent, the Reverend Mr. Herbert S. Bigelow, who was to spend the next several years being a bothersome, sanctimonious son of a bitch to Cincinnati politics and politicians of all parties. According to the Cincinnati Times-Star, Charter sold out to Bigelow in 36. They bargained their support for his candidacy for chairman of the Utilities Committee in exchange for Bigelow's support for Charterite Russell Wilson for mayor. For the next several years, Bigelow and his nominative successor, Wiley Craig, did a waltz clog of elections and resignations and shifts of support that would spin the head on a Philadelphia lawyer, leave alone a simple ward heeler like me. In 38, Craig was the independent in council. He went with the Republicans and made James Stewart mayor. And there was one year, 37, when neither of them was in council, and there was nobody to break the 4-4 tie votes between Charter and the GOP. During the years of that 4-4-1 stalemate, and under the subsequent Republican domination, Charter changed a lot. By 41, the committee was seriously forming itself into a continuing political entity. Russell Wilson's old beat the boss hobby horse was finally dead, and Charter concentrated on finding positive answers and planning positive action for vital city projects. The composition of the board of directors stayed much the same, east side of town, white, moneyed, and very middle class. But by the time Charter regained control of council in 1947, the elected ticket included 2 representatives of organized labor, Rollin Everett, who had been drawn to the Charter ticket by Arthur Thaxton, and Harry Proctor, 2 organization Democrats, Albert Cash and Edward Waldvogel, and 1 independent Republican, Charlie Taft, a far cry from the hilltop elitist group that had begun things back in 23. The years of control from 48 to 57 were some of the best for Charter. The master plan adopted in 1948 was the result of years of thought and planning, some of it traced all the way back to Alfred Bettman in 1925. The plan called for and planned for major advancements Charter felt the city needed in areas such as smoke control, housing, airport facilities, streets, transportation, health, recreation, things people need. The era was not unblemished. Taft didn't run in 51, and Dorothy Nichols Dalby ran and lost. The GOP took control. Carl Rich was mayor, but for only 2 years. In 1953, the grand old party used some campaign tactics that turned even my stomach. Senator Joseph McCarthy was the rage of Washington and national TV, and the local GOP thought that some McCarthyism was the very way to kill Charter at the polls. Republican Douglas Allen claimed to have uncovered a communist on the City Planning Commission. And in good McCarthy guilt by association style, the GOP labeled all of the commission's charter appointees, the charter councilmen, and indeed the entire charter committee membership as commies, or at least fellow travelers. The results were cataclysmic at the polls. The plan backfired. Charter was vindicated by an enraged and nauseated electorate. Ted Berry topped the ticket. Doc Dalby was elected along with John Gilligan, Edward Waldvogel, and Laborite Al Jordan. Later, an earnings tax question split the majority. Jordan voted against it. Early in 1954, Edward Waldvogel died in office, and for 6 months, Dorothy Dalby was mayor, the nation's first woman mayor of a major city. But then, in November, Jordan again voted with the Republicans to make Carl Rich mayor again. But in 55, Charles P. came back, ran, won, and became mayor, and the period of urban development, which was to flower much later, commenced under Charter leadership. Mayor Taft spearheaded the drive to get the freeway system and Queensgate 1 development started, and to get bond issues for the riverfront development and the new downtown convention center. As usual, Charter was planning ahead for tonight's celebration. Mrs. Dalby helped to push through a general hospital bond issue and another for a downtown parking garage. They were full and rich years for Charter, ones that made me have some serious doubts about the self-serving old days and old ways. But then in the late 50s, racial issues, the always controversial PR ballot, and breakup of the Charter Democratic Coalition cost Charter its majority and began 12 lean years. Now, PR was challenged in ballots in 36, 39, 47, and then in 54, when the GOP did something else that kind of made me sick. Why, it was something I might have thought up even. They organized the supposedly independent Charter Improvement League to campaign against PR. Now, that name took some thinking up. They attacked PR on several grounds. Among them, they blamed PR for what they privately called the overabundance of blacks on council. Ted Berry and Republican Jesse D. Locker. That 54 ballot had to be recounted twice, and PR stayed in, but by fewer than 1,000 votes. Some of the Democrats had grown lukewarm to PR, and the handwriting was on the wall. In 1957, there was still another repeal PR question on the ballot, and this time it carried. PR was lost, and Ted Berry lost too. The man who might have been mayor in 1953 and had to wait until 1972 to take the office he now so gracefully fills, was a celebrated issue in 57. The GOP whispered against Charter that if elected, they would sure as hell make that black man mayor. Now, the GOP had slated and elected black candidates to council as early as 1931, a man named Frank A.B. Hall, then R.P. McLean from 36 to 39, and the redoubtable Jesse Locker from 42 to 53. But Charter had always felt that Cincinnati's growing black community needed real representation and real social service, not just political stroking. In 1937, Dr. R.E. Beeman was Charter's first black candidate. He lost. Other black Charterites lost in 39 and 41, W.L. Anderson and Edward H. McReynolds. In 1948, Mrs. Marcus Rambo became Charter's first black board member. But back in 1945, the Charter Nominating Committee under Robert Goldman had urged Theodore M. Berry, then president of the local NAACP, to run. Berry noted Charter's record with black candidates and declined then. But in 47, he ran as an independent and lost, and in 49 ran and won as a Charterite. By 57, Charter had become a full-fledged political party, no longer just a band of reformers, but a political party with savvy, guts, organization, and drive. If the party hadn't had those things, for Lord knows there was little enough money for the job that needed doing, it would never have survived the next 12 years of being in the minority. The 58 Council had a 5-4 GOP majority, and it broke even my heart to see those clean, scrubbed, honest Republicans take over and take credit for a lot of urban development and civic improvements that had really been initiated during the prior charter years. In 1959, the coalition split. The Democrats ran their own candidates as Democrats, and 2 of them won. In 1961, Charlie Taft was the sole Charterite to be elected. The Republicans were outspending the Charter by 3-1 on campaigns. Charter was regularly having to take out bank loans up to $10,000, and what a risk that was. There was a lot of speculation about Charter just silently disbanding and stealing away. But at a fateful, soul-searching meeting in January of '62, Leonard Sive and Fred Roth led the battle to give the party one more gasp. The meeting began in gloom, but it left everybody heartened and ready for further challenge and service to the city. In '63, '65, and '67, Charter elected 2 councilmen. In 1965, Ted Berry left council to join the administration of President Lyndon Johnson and was succeeded by Myron Bush, whose untimely death in 1971 is still deeply mourned. In the 1967 elections, the GOP came through with a 6-1 majority. There was little joy in either the Charter or the Democratic camps. John Rao became president of Charter in '69, and shortly thereafter, at a suggestion made by Leonard Sive, Charter approached Democratic leaders John Wheathy and Sidney Weil about revitalizing the coalition. It happened. In 1969, the coalition took one seat from the GOP. In '71, the coalition took control of council. 3 Charterites, incumbents Taft and Berry, were joined by Bobby Stern. 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. In '73, it happened again, even bigger. 4 Charterites. Tom Brush joined the team. 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. And in '75, well, that's history still to be written. Way back in 1910, when me and my boys were running Cincinnati just the way we liked, who would ever have thought that in 1975 I'd glance back down there and find that that bunch of damned reformed-minded malcontents who banded together in 1925 were not only still around, but still in control of Cincinnati City Hall, and, damn it, getting stronger all the time. Tough as this is to say, if I were alive today, even I, George Barnsdale Cox, might consider voting Charter. It took 70 years, but I've finally seen the light.